You hear the creak of iron before you feel the pressure. Cold metal against your spine, rough hands forcing your chest toward your knees. Your ribs protest, then scream. You try to breathe, but there's nowhere for the air to go. The stone walls of the chamber blur as blood vessels in your eyes begin to rupture, painting your vision crimson. And through it all, one sound persists, the whisper of coarse wool scraping against your wrists as they tighten the bindings. Again and again. It's the last ordinary thing you'll hear before your body folds in on itself. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It amazes me every single time that a story this dark, from centuries past, can reach someone on the other side of the world right now. Her name was Margaret Davy, a 31-year-old woman from Suffolk, whose only documented crime was knowing too much about the wrong people. When they dragged her into the interrogation chamber beneath the Tower of London in 1539, she wasn't screaming. The records tell us she was silent, dangerously, defiantly silent, and that silence would cost her everything. This is Tudor England, the reign of Henry VIII, a kingdom obsessed with control, paranoid about conspiracy, and ruthlessly creative when it came to extracting confessions. But here's what the history books rarely emphasize. The most horrific torture device of this era wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to crush the human body so precisely, so methodically, that victims remained alive throughout their own destruction. No rack, no gallows, no public spectacle. Just compression. Just the slow, deliberate folding of a person until their organs had nowhere left to go. The device was called the scavenger's daughter, though that name hides its true nature behind bureaucratic euphemism. It was invented by Sir Leonard Skevington, Lieutenant of the Tower, and it operated on a principle that haunts anyone who studies it. The human body can be compressed far more than it can be stretched. While the rack pulled limbs apart, Skevington's creation did the opposite. It folded victims into themselves, creating catastrophic internal damage while leaving the outside relatively unmarked. To Tudor officials, this made it the civilized option. To the women and men trapped inside it, it was suffocation with a mechanical face. Margaret knelt in the center of the chamber, her breath sharp in the cold air as the guards moved with practiced precision. The first stepped behind her and pressed gently but firmly against her upper back, guiding her torso down toward her thighs. A second guard seized her arms and swept them behind her, folding them upward into an unnatural alignment that forced her shoulders to strain under the pressure. The third guard worked with quiet focus, fastening iron bands around her shins, her waist, and finally her wrists, securing each lock with a metallic click that echoed across the stone walls. Once every piece of the mechanism was in place, the guards began the tightening. The device functioned like a relentless hinge, a series of rigid beams linked by adjustable clasps that responded to each deliberate turn of a screw. With every rotation, the structure drew inward, shrinking the space around her. It did not injure her outright, but it pressed her body into an increasingly compact position. Insisting on a level of contortion no human form was ever meant to sustain. Margaret felt her body folding in on itself, her spine compelled into a deep curve, her breath becoming shallow as her ribcage was encouraged toward compression. Nothing snapped, nothing tore, yet the pressure told a different kind of story, one of tension, constriction, and the quiet threat of forces closing in from all directions. Her body, accustomed to standing freely with room for movement and breath, suddenly found itself in a confined frame where space had become a luxury. As the frame contracted further and the chamber seemed to narrow with it, Margaret held herself still, aware that the device was designed not for spectacle, but for control. A slow, calculated tightening meant to push her to the brink without ever letting the moment turn chaotic. The first physical response was immediate. Blood pressure spiked. Vessels in her face burst, creating dark streaks beneath her skin. Her breathing became shallow, desperate each inhale a fight against her own ribs. But the pain at this stage was almost secondary to the psychological horror, because Margaret could feel what was happening. She could feel her body being transformed from a living structure into a compacted mass. And she knew, with terrible clarity, that the men operating the device were in no hurry. This is where we need to pause and ask an uncomfortable question. Why this method? Why invent a machine specifically designed to fold human beings? The answer lies in Tudor England's unique blend of legalism and paranoia. Torture was not officially legal in England, not in the way it was codified on the continent, but the Privy Council, acting on the monarch's authority, used it regularly under the pretense of examination, and they needed confessions. Desperately. Because in a world of religious upheaval, political conspiracy, and royal succession crises, information was survival. But there was a catch. Confessions obtained through torture that left obvious permanent damage could be challenged. Confessions from broken, bleeding bodies could inspire sympathy. So Tudor interrogators developed methods that maximized agony while minimizing visible evidence. The Scavenger's Daughter was the pinnacle of this perverse innovation. Margaret's interrogator, a man named Thomas Wriothesley, later Earl of Southampton, and Lord Chancellor, leaned close to her contorted form. "Confess," he said, not shouted, whispered, because power in this room didn't need volume. It only needed inevitability. He wanted names. He wanted her to implicate others in a supposed plot against the king. Whether the plot existed didn't matter. What mattered was filling the ledger, satisfying the crown's hunger for control, proving that no one, man or woman, noble or commoner, could harbor secrets from royal authority. She said nothing, and they tightened the device another inch. Here's what that inch meant. The human rib cage is designed to expand outward with each breath, allowing the lungs to inflate. When compressed beyond a certain threshold, this becomes impossible. The lungs try to expand but meet resistance from the ribs, which are being pressed inward by the iron frame. The result is a sensation that witnesses described as silent drowning. You're gasping for air that technically exists, but your body cannot create the space to receive it. Meanwhile, internal organs, the liver, stomach, intestines, are being squeezed against each other and against the spine. Blood flow becomes erratic. The heart struggles to pump against the external pressure, and through it all, the victim remains conscious. That was the genius and the monstrosity of the design. It didn't allow escape through unconsciousness. It kept you present for every second of your unmaking. Margaret's vision began to fragment. Red dots swam across her sight as more blood vessels ruptured. Her ears filled with a roaring pressure, but what she remembered most, what she would later recount in a fragmented testimony given after her release, was the sound, that scratch of wool against her skin, the torturer's sleeve brushing her arm as he adjusted the clamps, the assistant's tunic dragging across her wrist as he checked her pulse. Ordinary fabric transformed into an auditory symbol of her destruction. It's a detail that appears again and again in Tudor torture records, this intrusion of the mundane into the catastrophic. The human mind, even in extremis, clings to small sensory details, and for women especially, whose torture was often carried out with this veneer of procedural calm, The quiet sounds became more haunting than screams. But here's the twist that history almost lost. Margaret didn't break. Not at the first compression, not at the second. And by the third turn of the screw, something unexpected happened. The device jammed. Not catastrophically, not obviously. Just a subtle resistance in the mechanism, a hinge worn from use, a screw thread stripped by repetitive force. The torturer pulled the lever. Nothing. He pulled again. The frame refused to contract further or release. In that frozen moment, Margaret Davy, crushed, bleeding, barely breathing, became a problem. Tudor law, for all its cruelty, was obsessed with procedure. If the torture device malfunctioned, if the examination couldn't be completed according to protocol, the confession's validity could be questioned. And questioning meant paperwork, inquiries, delays, the kind of administrative nightmare that made courtiers nervous. So the men in the chamber faced a choice: continue with a broken device and risk legal challenges, or stop and admit mechanical failure. Either option was embarrassing. Either option meant Margaret had inadvertently won a battle she never asked to fight. They stopped, not out of mercy, out of bureaucratic anxiety. And in that cessation, Margaret survived. She was released from the frame, carried to a cell, and left to recover under guard. Her ribs had been compressed, but not broken. Her organs were bruised, hemorrhaging in places, but functional. She could breathe again, though every inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. And 3 weeks later, when a different interrogator tried a different approach, verbal coercion, threats against her family, she still refused to give them the names they wanted, because by then, Margaret had seen something her torturers didn't want her to see. She had seen them panic. She had watched the system of fear stumble over its own machinery. That brief interruption, the jam in the mechanism, the moment of hesitation, the frantic shuffle of paperwork and muttered instructions, exposed something deeper than any instrument in a Tudor chamber. It revealed the truth hidden beneath the spectacle of torture. It had never truly been a contest of physical endurance or brute force. It had always been a performance. A carefully arranged theater meant to convince the prisoner that the state was an unbreakable monolith, that its machinery moved with perfect precision, and that resistance, physical, mental, or moral, was already a lost cause. The device, the room, the uniforms, the rehearsed severity of the guards, all of it was meant to project inevitability. But when the mechanism faltered, even for a breath, the illusion cracked like thin ice. The aura of flawless authority evaporated, leaving only the raw human truth beneath it. And Margaret, bent almost double, her vision dimming at the edges, felt that truth settle over her with startling clarity. In her half-conscious state, she looked at the men surrounding her not as shadowed executioners or agents of some absolute power, but as they truly were. They were administrators of pain, clerks bound to procedure, men whose authority depended entirely on tools that could jam and systems that could fail. They were not the embodiment of the state, but the servants of its anxieties, terrified not of her resistance, but of their own machinery revealing its weakness. In that instant, Margaret understood that the device was not the only thing held together by screws and tension. The entire performance of power was, she was eventually released without confessing, a rarity that speaks to either exceptional will or exceptional luck, likely both. The record suggests she lived another 17 years, though with chronic pain and difficulty breathing. She never spoke publicly about her ordeal, but a letter exists, held in the British Library's archives, written by a Protestant reformer who interviewed Margaret in 1542. In it, She describes the sound of the wool scraping her wrists. She describes the moment the device jammed, and she describes the look on Wriothesley's face, not rage, but something worse: embarrassment. The petty frustration of a functionary whose tool had failed him. That letter matters because it humanizes what official records deliberately obscure. Tudor torture documents are clinical, detached. They list names, dates, and devices with the same tone used for inventory lists. Margaret Davy, examined by compression the 12th of October, 1539. No mention of ruptured blood vessels. No description of the sound of her breathing. Just a line in a ledger. But Margaret's letter, passed quietly among reform circles, told the story the Crown wanted buried. It told of a woman who endured the unendurable and emerged with her will intact. It told of a torture device that, for all its engineering, could still fail. And it told of a government so insecure that it needed to fold bodies into submission because it couldn't fold minds. The scavenger's daughter was used sporadically throughout the Tudor period, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. What we know is that it was disproportionately used on women, particularly women accused of religious dissent, espionage, or knowing inconvenient information. Why women? Because Tudor society was obsessed with female silence. A woman who spoke too freely, who refused to confess, who maintained her own version of truth, was a threat to the entire social order. Torture became a tool, not just of interrogation, but of gender enforcement. Breaking a woman's body was seen as a way to restore her to proper submission. And the scavenger's daughter, with its emphasis on compression and containment, carried a grotesque symbolic weight. It literally forced women inward, collapsing their physical presence just as society demanded they collapse their voices. But history has a way of preserving what tyrants try to destroy. Margaret's story survived. So did the testimonies of other women and askew, tortured on the rack. Elizabeth Barton, the nun of Kent, executed for prophecy. Countless unnamed midwives, servants, and wives whose words were deemed too dangerous. Their bodies were meant to be warnings. Instead, they became evidence. Evidence that systems built on fear are inherently unstable. Evidence that cruelty, no matter how procedurally refined, cannot erase the human capacity for defiance. The device itself still exists. A replica sits in the Tower of London's torture exhibit, accompanied by a small placard that describes it as a form of compression torture. Visitors walk past it quickly, uncomfortable, uncertain how to process the mechanics of such calculated suffering. But if you stand there long enough, if you imagine the stone chamber, the cold iron, the scratch of wool against skin, you begin to understand something the Tudor authorities never wanted you to know. The most powerful weapon against tyranny isn't strength or strategy. It's the simple, stubborn refusal to disappear. It's the decision to remain a person, even when the state insists you're property. It's the knowledge that machinery breaks, systems falter, and the truth they try to crush will eventually unfold. Margaret Davies's body was never meant to carry significance. In the eyes of those who commanded the chamber, she was intended to be a marginal note in a record book, a small warning etched into the margins of state memory. A caution, nothing more. Yet instead of vanishing into the machinery of punishment, she became something far more dangerous to the system that sought to compress her into silence. She became an observer, one who saw not only her own ordeal, but the truth behind the hands that imposed it. With each turn of the screw, each tightening of the cold iron frame, the men surrounding her believed they were demonstrating dominance, reinforcing the unshakable force of authority. But the rhythm of their work, betrayed something very different. Their determination did not speak of confidence but of urgency, as though every additional degree of pressure was an attempt to smother the doubt rising in their own throats. Margaret felt it even through the haze of pain, the tremor in their movements, the way they glanced at the device as though hoping it would not betray them again. Each adjustment revealed them not as masters of an impenetrable system, but as men desperately trying to uphold the facade of one. The power they wielded was not clean or absolute. It wavered with every mechanical strain. In that stalled instant, when the machine jammed and the chamber fell into uneasy stillness, Margaret understood something the state never intended her to realize. Their authority was not built on certainty. It was built on fear, fear of disobedience, fear of failure, fear that the very tools meant to enforce order might expose the weakness at its core. And desperation, she saw with piercing clarity, is nothing more than fear dressed in official colors. The scratch of wool still echoes, not as a sound of suffering, but as a reminder that history remembers, that voices endure, and that some people, no matter how tightly they're folded, refuse to break.